Jessie King's story is one shrouded in eerie darkness and chilling despair. How did a young woman become a symbol of desperation and horror in Victorian Scotland? What secrets lurked beneath her cold facade? And why did her actions ignite a scandal that shocked a nation? Join us as we unravel a haunting case of tragic crime, lies, and twisted fate. In the dreary streets of late 19th century Edinburgh, a city riddled with poverty and moral contradiction, Jessie King was born in the year 1879. From the very beginning, her life was marked by hardship, tragedy, and an unrelenting struggle against the crushing weight of Victorian societal expectations. Her family, impoverished and fractured, battled daily just to survive, and Jessie quickly learned that innocence meant little in the face of relentless adversity. Raised in a squalid tenement, Jessie's childhood was far from idyllic. She was the youngest of several siblings, and her mother struggled to provide for them all after the loss of the family patriarch. Education was a luxury Jessie was denied, forced instead into labor at a tender age. The unforgiving environment shaped her youth, fostering a resilience, but also planting seeds of desperation and isolation. By her early teens, Jessie had already borne the heavy burden of illegitimacy, significant stigma in Victorian Scotland when she gave birth to her first child. The father, a man whose identity was never conclusively revealed, disappeared from her life, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. The newborn lived only a short time, and the secrecy and sorrow surrounding the child's death cast a shadow that would haunt Jessie for years to come. The streets of Edinburgh's old town were a harsh mistress, and Jessie found herself drawn into a murky underworld of poverty, petty crime, and societal judgment. She made a living as a seamstress, and by taking in laundry, eking out a fragile existence. But poverty was relentless and unforgiving. The social systems in place offered little support, especially for women like Jessie, marginalized and voiceless. What followed was the beginning of a dark pattern. Jessie became known to local authorities for wandering the streets with children in her care who were discovered to be malnourished or neglected. Rumors swirled about the true nature of Jessie's relationships with these children, and whispers of baby farming, a cruel practice where impoverished women took in infants for payment, often neglecting, or worse, began to surface. Did Jessie, lost to desperation, resort to such grim measures? The truth was far from straightforward, tangled in layers of secrecy, pity, and horror. Jessie's repeated brushes with the law only heightened the public's fascination and revulsion. The city's newspapers eagerly chronicled her missteps, painting her alternately as a pitiable victim of circumstance or a sinister figure preying on the innocent. Yet Jessie remained an enigma, unwilling or unable fully explain the tragedies and disappearances associated with her. In a city where morality was tightly policed and the boundaries of acceptable womanhood rigidly defined, Jessie King's existence was both a symptom and a challenge to Victorian ideals. Authorities grew increasingly watchful, and the tension simmered beneath the surface, setting the stage for a crisis that would shock Edinburgh and ripple far beyond its grey stone streets. As we delve deeper into Jessie's life, we will uncover the circumstances that led her to the devastating acts that sealed her fate. What drove her? Was it madness, cruelty, or the desperate ambition of a woman crushed by society? The answers lie buried in the shadows of history, and they reveal a truth more haunting than fiction. If you are compelled by the darkest corners of history and human nature, don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. What do you think motivates someone like Jessie King to cross the final line? Share your thoughts and theories below. Want to hear your perspectives as we continue unraveling this grim tale. As the years rolled on, Jessie King's reputation grew darker, intensified by a series of tragic incidents that consumed the attention of local authorities and the public alike. Despite her youth, Jessie had become a mother multiple times, each pregnancy wrapped in silence and marked by loss. The fate of these newborns, most of whom died under mysterious circumstances, off a vile sensation in the city. By the mid-1890s, baby farming had become a notorious practice in Britain, particularly among desperate women struggling to survive impoverished conditions. It involved taking in infants for a fee, but often led to neglect, starvation, and death. Jessie, slipping further into this grim world, was suspected of participating in these arrangements, and her home was frequently scrutinized. However, proving guilt was a challenge, as many infants died quietly and records were scarce. In the spring of 1898, a particularly horrifying discovery shattered any pretense of innocence remaining around Jessie. Police raided a grim flat in Edinburgh's Cowgate, alarmed by reports from neighbors who claimed foul odors and mysterious comings and goings. What they uncovered was a chilling sight. Several infant corpses were found hidden in trunks and boxes within the cramped lodging. The official police reports described the scene as one of the most grotesque in recent memory. The infants, some no older than a few months, displayed signs of extreme neglect and malnourishment. The macabre collection pointed directly to one woman, Jessie King. She was swiftly arrested and charged with murder, accused of intentionally drowning and abandoning the children in her care. The ensuing investigation peeled back layers of sorrow, desperation, and societal failure. Jessie's background, previously shrouded in mystery, began to unravel. Inspectors discovered she had given birth to at least 6 children, all of whom purportedly died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Neighbors recalled a once quiet woman who now exhibited signs of mental instability, said to mutter about burdens and voices she could not escape. However, the case was not straightforward. Defense attorneys painted Jessie as a victim of the cruelest circumstances, a young woman doomed by poverty, little education, and a lack of support. They argued that she suffered from what was then termed hysterical madness brought on by her overwhelming environment. Her actions, they claimed, were the desperate acts of someone trapped by overwhelming forces, rather than cold-blooded malice. The trial gripped Scotland, the courtroom filled with a charged atmosphere, as Victorian moral debates clashed with a rising awareness of social and economic pressures on women. Was Jessie King a monstrous killer, or a tragic casualty of a brutal society? The jury wrestled with the gruesome evidence and conflicting narratives. Throughout the trial, Jessie remained a haunting figure, often silent or weeping, rarely offering clear testimony. Her frailty in the witness box lent a heartbreaking dimension to the proceedings, but it did little to sway the judgment looming over her future. The courtroom drama was punctuated by intense arguments over whether Jessie's acts were criminal or pathological, a question that exposed the inadequacies of the legal and medical understanding of mental health at the turn of the century. Media sensationalism added fuel to the fire, with newspapers presenting graphic depictions and public opinion teetering between horror and sympathy. As the verdict neared, the tension was palpable. The fate of Jessie King would not only reflect on her, but also on the social conscience of the time. The final moments of the trial promised to deliver a verdict that would echo through history, testing the boundaries between justice and mercy. What would the court decide? Punishment or pity? The answer lay just beyond the next chapter, waiting to be revealed. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver his sentence. After days of harrowing testimony and heated debate, the jury rendered a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder against Jessie King. The weight of the decision was immense, compounded by the fact that Jessie was barely 20 years old at the time, a girl who had known nothing but poverty and pain. The judge pronounced the sentence with stern finality: death by hanging. The verdict sent shockwaves throughout Edinburgh and across Scotland. Many were deeply divided. Some saw justice served to a woman who had destroyed innocent lives, while others mourned what they perceived as society's failure to protect a vulnerable soul. The weeks following the trial offered a grim glimpse into Jessie's final days. Prison life was bleak, dominated by isolation and the looming shadow of execution. Reports from prison wardens and visitors described her as withdrawn and fragile, speaking little of her past or the children who had been lost. Occasionally, she would mutter cryptic words hinting at guilt, confusion, or remorse, but the true depth of her inner torment remained obscured. Beyond the prison walls, public opinion churned. Reformers and advocates for women's mental health began to question the harshness of the sentence, pointing to Jessie's age and psychological state as mitigating factors. The tale became a symbol of the need to reconsider the treatment of female offenders, especially those burdened by mental illness or social despair. As the day of execution approached, the atmosphere around Edinburgh grew tense and somber. Crowds gathered outside the prison, a mixture of curiosity, condemnation, and sympathy visible on the faces of those who came to witness or protest. Letters poured into government offices, pleading for clemency, and petitions circulated demanding a stay of execution. Yet the machinery of justice moved inexorably forward. On the eve of her execution, Jessie penned a letter that revealed a rare glimpse of her humanity expressions of sorrow, a hope for forgiveness, and pleas for the well-being of loved ones left behind. The letter was smuggled out by a trusted jailer and published in newspapers, stirring public debate anew about the morality of capital punishment and the plight of women crushed beneath societal neglect. Execution Day dawned cold and gray, befitting the grim end to an already horrifying saga. Jessie King was led to the gallows in Edinburgh prison. Witnesses recount her silence and stoicism, a stark contrast to the fury and fear that had once consumed the city. The trapdoor fell, and her life was extinguished in moments, closing the chapter on a case that had captivated and horrified a nation. Years after her death, the legacy of Jessie King lingered in the collective memory. Scholars and historians would revisit the case as a tragic example of the confluence of poverty, mental illness, and rigid Victorian morality. Her story illuminated the fractures in a society that allowed such desperation to fester unnoticed until tragedy erupted. But the true horror did not end with her execution. New evidence surfaced decades later, raising uncomfortable questions about whether Jessie was solely to blame or if deeper systemic failures had created the conditions for this nightmare. Were innocent lives lost purely because of one woman's ruthless choices, or was she another casualty of a merciless era that punished victims instead of aiding them? With justice delivered, but questions unresolved, the story of Jessie King remained a haunting lesson in the dark edges of human nature and society's responsibilities. What truth lay buried beneath the judgment? The unsettling answers awaited in the next chapters of this chilling tale. Decades after Jessie King's execution, a re-evaluation of her case brought to light striking revelations that deepened the mystery and tragedy surrounding her life. Historians and criminologists began to re-examine the overlaps of Victorian law enforcement, social welfare, and the harsh realities faced by impoverished women, revealing a society that often pushed the most vulnerable into desperation. Notably, the phenomenon of baby farming, which played a central role in Jessie King's story, was far more widespread and complex than initially understood. Many women trapped in poverty took in infants, sometimes successfully caring for them, but often overwhelmed by limited resources and social isolation. The law was slow to regulate or prevent these practices, allowing neglect and abuse to flourish under the guise of informal childcare. New archival evidence surfaced, including letters, court records, and testimonies from women who lived at the margins of society. These documents reflected a pattern of social abandonment, failure of community support systems, and public health initiatives. Through these lenses, Jessie's crimes were viewed not simply as acts of individual depravity, but as symptoms of a broken societal framework. Further analysis of the forensic reports from the time showed that while many infants died under suspicious circumstances, some deaths could be attributed to natural causes exacerbated by poverty and malnutrition rather than deliberate murder. This blurred the line between criminal intent and tragic neglect, complicating the narrative that had condemned Jessie King so thoroughly. More controversially, some historians proposed the theory that Jessie may have been manipulated or pressured by others involved in the baby farming network, a shadowy world entwined with illicit adoption and exploitation. Whether coerced or complicit, the extent to which she acted alone remained uncertain, fueling debates that challenged the simplistic portrayal of her guilt. Mental health experts revisiting the case suggested that Jessie experienced immense psychological trauma, compounded by repeated losses, stigma, and possibly undiagnosed mental illness. At a time when women were often dismissed as hysterical or unstable, such factors were rarely given weight in court. Consequently, her actions were judged by standards ill-equipped to understand the complexities of human suffering. The story of Jessie King became a cornerstone example in the campaign against capital punishment and the call for reform in laws governing child welfare, mental health, and women's rights. Her case inspired scrutiny of the punitive approaches at the time and underscored the need for more compassionate and scientifically informed legal processes. Despite this growing understanding, the chilling details of Jessie's life remain striking. The cold shadows where she navigated, the silence of the infants who never grew, and the desperate choices that led to irreversible tragedy. Her name became synonymous with the darker side of Victorian society, a symbol of how poverty and societal neglect can metastasize into horror. The question remained, was Jessie King a villain, a victim, or a tragic amalgamation of both? This painful ambiguity ensured her story would not be forgotten, but debated and remembered as a grim reflection of history's darkest chapters. As we approach the final parts of this story, the human cost of this tragedy becomes clear, and we will explore how Jessie's legacy influenced changes and continued to haunt the collective conscience. What does this case tell us about justice, mercy, and the hidden anguish behind every headline? Prepare for the startling revelations that lie ahead. The legacy of Jessie King rippled far beyond her execution, casting a long shadow over the social reforms that followed. Her case illuminated the brutal conditions endured by impoverished women and infants in Victorian Britain, sparking debates that would shape future policies around child welfare and mental health laws. In the aftermath, activist groups devoted themselves to exposing the horrors of baby farming and the failures of public health institutions. Reports and investigations led to greater scrutiny of homes taking in vulnerable children, resulting in stricter regulations and the establishment of state-run childcare facilities. These reforms aimed to prevent the tragic neglect and abuse epitomized by Jessie King's story. Meanwhile, her case ignited conversations about the treatment of female offenders, particularly those accused of crimes involving their own children. The harsh sentences handed to women like Jessie were increasingly viewed as insufficiently nuanced, failing to consider mental health disorders or the desperate social conditions that contributed to their circumstances. This growing awareness influenced the gradual emergence of forensic psychiatry as a discipline, prompting courts to incorporate psychological evaluations before sentencing. Jessie King's trial, with its glaring lack of mental health recognition, came to symbolize the need for this crucial evolution in justice. The sensational media coverage of Jessie's life and death also contributed to changing public perceptions. Newspapers alternated between demonization and pity, reflecting society's struggle to reconcile the conflicting views of morality, gender, and responsibility. These portrayals, while sometimes exploitative, helped shift the discourse toward empathy and social reform. Yet beneath the legal and social ripples lay the human stories that the headlines often overlooked: the mothers forced to give up babies, the children suffering in silence, and the women condemned by their circumstances. Jessie King's tale is a haunting reminder that behind every sensational case lies a network of suffering and societal failure. As time passed, Jessie became a figure studied not only by criminologists, but also by artists, writers, and historians who sought to interpret her life through different lenses. Plays, poems, and novels emerged, each probing whether she was a monster or a victim, a cautionary tale or a call for compassion. The enduring fascination with Jessie King reveals a collective grappling with themes still relevant today: poverty, mental illness, misogyny, and the thin line between justice and mercy. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members and challenges us to prevent history from repeating its darkest moments. If you find yourself drawn into the complexity of Jessie's story and the societal echoes it provoked, remember to subscribe to stay engaged with history's most unsettling true crimes. How do you think societal pressures shaped Jessie's fate? Share your thoughts as we move into the final revelations of this haunting tale. In the decades following Jessie King's tragic demise, her story became more than a grim historical footnote. It evolved into a symbol for the ongoing struggle to understand the intersection of poverty, mental illness, and justice in society. Her case inspired reflection on how far legal and social systems had come, and how far they still had to go. The lingering questions about her culpability prompted modern historians and psychologists to ponder alternative explanations for her behavior. Was Jessie truly a cold-hearted murderer, or a victim of conditions beyond her control? Some scholars argue that trauma, compounded by the devastating losses of her children, fractured her mental state, impairing her ability to care for the infants in her charge. Research into Victorian-era mental health treatment reveals that women like Jessie were often institutionalized under dubious grounds or criminalized for behaviors stemming from distress and neglect. At the time, understanding of postpartum mental illnesses was virtually non-existent, and the stigma attached to illegitimacy and poverty only exacerbated isolation. Jessie King's story also raises broader ethical questions about how societies punish or support those who commit devastating acts born of desperation. The harshness of her sentence stands as a stark reminder of the Victorian justice system's priorities, often rigid, punitive, and lacking empathy. It also foreshadowed evolving perspectives about rehabilitation and the importance of addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of crime. In contemporary times, Jessie's case continues to be a cautionary tale studied in criminology and social history programs. It urges reflection on child protection, mental health, and the socio-economic factors influencing crime. The tragedy underlines the necessity of compassionate systems that recognize human complexity. Moreover, her story touches on a persistent societal theme: how women who transgress societal norms, especially mothers, are judged more harshly, often denied the understanding extended to others. The shame and secrecy surrounding motherhood outside socially accepted frameworks can have devastating impacts, a theme tragically embodied in Jessie's life. As we conclude this chilling examination of Jessie King, we are left to wrestle with the paradox of her existence, both condemned and pitied, both monster and victim. Her life and death challenge us to look beyond headlines and verdicts, to consider the human stories beneath, and to strive for a justice system that balances accountability with mercy. This exploration reminds us that history's darkest tales are not merely about evil, but about the complex interplay of human frailty, societal neglect, and the desperate choices that arise when systems fail the vulnerable. Jessie King's story remains a haunting reflection on the costs of ignorance and the enduring need for empathy. Thank you for journeying through this sobering and haunting story. Remember to subscribe for more historical true crime sagas that confront the shadows of our past and reveal the human stories within. What lessons do you think Jessie King's life holds for us today? Share your insights and keep the conversation alive as we learn from the haunting echoes of history.